You might have to go to the tourism gardens first,
So you have to live with your neighbours.
It sounds romantic until you get a bad neighbour,
Just waiting on our friends to join us on Zoom. Good afternoon, everyone, formally. Welcome to the April John Cain Luncheon here at Graduate House with the Capita and the John Cain Foundation. We are meeting, as always, on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and thank them for their custodianship over many thousands of years of the lands and waters on which we live, which were never ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I'm excited today because we're going to hear from my friend Chris Wallace, who has, along with Renée McCaffrie and Michelle Grattan, co-edited this very interesting book, The Morrison Government Governing Through Crisis. We have some copies available for you to buy here today, which I'm sure Chris will be happy to sign. We can still only take cash. At our next one, I promise, will be set up to take card payments. They're $40 each, so it's not at the end if you would like to buy one. I have a chapter in the book, shameless self-promotion, called Robo-Debts and Roller Coasters, Social Insecurity in the 46th Parliament. And I only know that I got in to write that chapter at Chris's invitation, which was very generous of her, because there are some really impressive people writing in this book, which I have had a quick read of, and it is very, very interesting indeed. So, without further preamble from me, please welcome Dr. Chris Wallace. Thanks, Emma. Wow. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people, and honour their elders, past and present. Thanks so much, Emma Dawson, her Capita CEO, for the invitation to come and lunch with you today. Emma's far too modest. She is a magnificent contributor to this book, and I can tell you where I come from, Ngunnawal country, Canberra. Emma is incredibly respected as an expert in her field. She's not one to advertise it, but the number of very senior figures in the government who ring and ask for quiet advice that leads to decisive steers in better policy directions can't be overstated. So well done, Emma. You're very visible in Melbourne as a contributor, but you're not visible to Melburnians as a contributor in Canberra. But believe me, everyone knows who she is and very much appreciates her involvement and very positive intentions. So it's wonderful to be, as I feel very strongly, among friends. I am 100% certain that everyone here today, in person and online, are people who are about good government. On the plane down today, I read this wonderful book, and probably a few people in the room have read it. Hit the online used bookstores and get a copy. It is unbelievable. John Cain's Years, Power, Parties and Politics. John Cain's memoir, and it's extremely focused on good government. I had not appreciated until I read it, though, just what a phenomenal record he left of his experience in government, his achievements in government, but also the tribulations of Labor in and out of power. He recorded a diary throughout his involvement in Labor politics, and I'm quite an old political historian, and I was not aware of the diaries. I'm going to track them down after this. But this is a phenomenally good book, and with the Albanese government being not quite yet a year old, it's a very relevant account of a party out of power for a long time, suddenly finding itself on the Treasury benches and having to work out what to do. And of course, John Cain was a very reliable guiding light for the relevant government, in this case Victoria. Just to quote one paragraph from the book, he's talking about this desire for good government. It was about our determination to do things better than they had been done before. In a sense, Cain said, this reflected a commitment to good government and a preparedness to run with an issue that helped the cause of good government while perhaps offering no immediate reward. That's a pretty unusual approach to politics these days. Labor does much better on the strategic long-term thinking front, but can unthinkingly, like all humans, fall into the bad old ways, follow the path contingency, down rabbit holes and cul-de-sacs. So there's a degree of consciousness that's required when you take over the reins again. It's very exciting. There's lots of people around you to facilitate action. It's good to pause and just think sometimes about where you're at and make sure the course is a true one. And I think this book is a phenomenal real life case study in that. And if I could republish it and send a copy to all Albanese government ministers, I would. Not a single one of them wouldn't profit from reading it, even those who are doing extremely well. So I'm going to propose that we strike a new version of that rubber wristband that so many American kids wear that says WWJD, what would Jesus do? I think we need to have some struck and handed out WWJCD. What would John Cain do, as a kind of first instinctive guide to reasonable action?
Capita can fund the production.
Great. Well, next time I come to this lunch, I'm hoping there'll be one on every table. And just before finishing this book, I was a journalist in the press gallery during the Hawke and Keating governments, and Cain's chapter on federal-state relations and the operations of premiers' conferences and the dominance of Treasury on, he wasn't outright against, but he just wanted more constructive engagement on, so that it could be made better in the direction of good government and good things for citizens. It's a phenomenal account and one that made me rethink some of my reporting during that period, even though I'm very admiring of the Hawke and Keating governments overall. So now to this book, The Morrison Government, Governing Through Crisis, 2019 to 2022. Yes, governing through crisis is a double entendre, at least from this co-editor. I did sneakily slip that into the title. I'm not sure my wonderful co-editors, Michelle Grattan from The Conversation at the University of Canberra, like me, and Brendan McCaffrie, also from the University of Canberra, like me. I'm not sure they will really sign up to the double entendre, but I can tell you I was totally and remain very committed to it. It's an interesting book, and it's just, again, worth pausing to think about where this book came from. This is the 14th volume in the, oh my God, Brian Howard. Okay, along with David McKenzie, the former member for Diamond Valley. We've got some royalty here. Okay, except for royalty. Yes, so this is the 14th volume in the University of Canberra's Commonwealth Administration series. How boring does that sound? Very boring, but incredibly important. There's this fabulous de facto agreement in Canberra that after every election, the ANU produces a volume, an editor collection on the conduct of the election, the actual lead up to and conduct of the election from many, many different standpoints. The University of Canberra, for its part, always produces a volume on which is public administration and policy focused, covering the term of government, the whole period of government between the two elections. So this has been going on for several decades now, and a bit like John Cain's diaries, it's a phenomenal resource providing a coherent picture of public policy and administration and politics in federal government from multiple perspectives, not from single author perspectives. And as such, it's a remarkable resource for researchers. I think political scientists, historians would do well to actually go through the series and try and draw some longer conclusions. And it's a great work of informal collaborative scholarship between the two universities to very good national effect. So, as I said, this is the 14th term of government that's been covered in this series. Like a lot of these long-run publishing projects, they can fall into a bit of a hole. The last few were published by very minor publishers. This time we're with a big publisher, we're with New South, in fact with UNSW Press, the academic arm of New South Publications, which has its own distribution arm. So unlike most scholarly publications, you can actually find it in bookshops. And that's the whole point, right? You know, academics, we're too fond of talking to ourselves and not engaging with the world. And this is a very conscious effort to break out of this and get it out in real readers' hands, not least politicians, staffers, branch members, and so forth. So I'm going to not attempt today to summarise, précis, sum up any of those things this volume. It's impossible. Its contributors are remarkable. A couple of my favourites, Renée Leon, the Australian public servant who was the one when the politicians wouldn't hit the stop button on robo-debt, hit the stop button and then got sacked 4 weeks later. I commissioned her to write the chapter on the public service under the Morrison Government during this period. Phenomenal chapter. Geoffrey Watson SC on government integrity. Phenomenal. On and on it goes. It's a really stellar cast. It's very well written. I guarantee that because I was involved and I know that people don't read boring things by and large. So honestly, it's a knockout book. I'm going to just give you a little bit of a sense of it, some of the contributions, just by reading, in some cases, a sentence, in some cases, a paragraph from a few of the contributors. So Karen Middleton, the Canberra correspondent for the Saturday paper. Who reads Karen Middleton in the Saturday paper? Can I just, wow, that is fantastic. Yep, brainy audience. You'll be very familiar with Karen's work, and of course she was named the Press Gallery Journalist of the Year last year by the Press Gallery itself. This very same group that by and large ignored so many of her path-breaking stories during this period of governing through crisis, right? Karen Middleton is a dogged, determined, detailed, policy and process-oriented journalist of a kind that is almost unknown in Australian political journalism anymore. She's gold, you know. If there was a bus coming, I would throw myself under to protect her journalism ahead of my own. She's really phenomenal. Just a couple of things during this period of government that she covered in the Saturday paper that weren't followed up by the colleagues. The Prime Minister's employment record. Now, getting moved on dodgily from one CEO position might be an accident. Getting moved on under very suspicious circumstances from two in another country, that's a pattern. And Karen did a phenomenal job flushing out the details. She was also the person who cracked the code on how Scott Morrison was escaping through his subcommittee of National Cabinet of one, actually it was Cabinet who did this, in order to evade FLI exposure to many of his decisions. She's great. Anyway, just one sentence from Karen's chapter, Delegating Democracy, Parliament in the Morrison era. Over its term and a bit in office, the Morrison government treated federal parliament less as the centrepiece of Australian democracy and more as something between a political weapon and an inconvenience. Yeah. Renée Leon, on the public service under Morrison. The increasingly overt agenda of recent Conservative governments to reduce the role and undermine the capacity of the public service has morphed from a preference for small government and light regulation to a concerted effort to limit evidence and expertise as the basis for government, with significant implications for effective governance and public trust. That's a truly shocking thing for a senior distinguished public servant to say about that term of office. Katharine Murphy and Matthew Ricketson on the Morrison Government and the media refers to the crocodile death roll politicians and journalists have been engaged in for at least a decade, whereby political spin and journalistic gotcha moments mutually reinforce each other in a dispiritingly downward spiral. Just think about it, folks. You know, we're pretty much in this room of a certain age. 20 of the last 26 years, the coalition has been in office federally and has been inculcating that kind of mindset. 2/3 of the time in the post-war period, the coalition has been in office nationally. I'll just let that sit there for a minute. Emma Dawson. Fantastic chapter, Robojets and Roller Coasters, Social Insecurity in the 46th Parliament. Perhaps the most famous refrain of our 30th Prime Minister was the claim that if you have a go, you'll get a go. Yet the events and policy responses that govern the lives of Australia's most vulnerable citizens in the years between 2019 and 2022 ruled Scott Morrison's favourite slogan to be a hollow rationalisation for callousness, and one utterly without basis in fact. If the 46th Parliament showed us anything, it is that the go in Australia is no longer fair, neither as a reward for individual effort, nor as a return on the social contract established in the years after our last great global upheaval, the Second World War. Yeah. Julianne Schultz on communications policy. Paul Keating, whose term as Prime Minister ended in a landslide loss in 1996, lost no time rubbing salt into Scott Morrison's wounds when his term ended in a similarly humiliating fashion. Quote, "The point about the Morrison government," Keating declared, pausing for dramatic emphasis before brandishing his verbal sword, "was that there was no point to it." Goes on Julianne Schultz. On one reading, nothing much happened, apart from the government responding to events. On the other, the power of the oligopoly that long dominated the communications sector saw its positions entrenched with government support. Under the cover of pandemic relief, the oligopoly won concessions that were plausibly urgent and necessary, and others had quietly coveted and hoped to see permanently extended. This was arguably the point of the Morrison government. It was not without purpose. Its point was to entrench the power of the prevailing status quo and hold challenges at bay. The last little bit I'll read is from Weekends and Wars, The Stalling of Climate Change Policy by Darren Sinclair and Joe Mummery. This is a tiny bit longer, but it seems so incredibly important. Overall, the Morrison government's approach to climate change policy was characterised by denial, marginalisation, reactivity, and politicisation. Denial in terms of ignoring both the immediacy and severity of the negative consequences of climate change and the potential economic, employment, environmental, and national security benefits derived from the transition to a low-carbon economy. Marginalisation in terms of viewing climate change policy and the scientific evidence underpinning the need for action as something on the periphery, both of its core agenda and the perceived interests of the Australian community, for at least those parts that have traditionally voted for the coalition. Reactivity in terms of not anticipating or adequately preparing to address either the impacts of or the opportunities arising from climate change, instead only doing so reluctantly and without a full commitment when its hand was forced by external circumstances and often well after the fact. And politicisation in terms of preferencing the exploitation of perceived short-term political advantage by creating division over climate change issues rather than seeking to build consensus for a policy platform that would deliver substantial long-term benefits to the nation. I just want to pause for a moment here and ask you to think back on Australia in 1996 when the Howard government was elected. Howard really shot the gun on the new generation of the quality of government when he bulleted 1/3 of the federal government's departmental secretaries. A revolutionary style signal to say, when I say jump, you say how high. And this is where we have ended up as a result. We all need to think about the long-term trajectory of the Morrison government as the culmination of what John Howard started. And as the official cabinet historian for the release of the year 2000 and year 2001 cabinet papers, it was very interesting to me how long the APS held out against the forces of degradation unleashed then. The core departments were still making quite good arguments, for example, about climate change policy. There was still a broad evidence consensus in the APS, accepted by many ministers even, like Robert Hill, that a market-based solution to carbon was the way to go. And of course, John Howard did remarkably take that proposal to price carbon to the 2007 election, but lost, and we'll never know whether he would have gone through with it. So, John Cain, what would John Cain do? Well, he would turn at this minute to his own book and ask us to reflect on his afterword, or part of his afterword. And I really think this is incredibly important on a day when we have seen the most phenomenally positive polling for the Albanese government that we could impossibly imagine seeing at this point a year in, when reality is usually biting. Instead, as the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald cast it today, the Albanese government is getting a second honeymoon, significantly because the federal opposition is so incredibly bad, so out of touch, so alienated from the concerns of mainstream Australia. One of the sidebar stories today was, of course, Coalition frontbencher Karen Andrews' decision not to stand for Parliament at the next election, something which I'm very sorry about personally. Such as it is, and I know there's a context to this, way to the right, but of the remaining coalition senior figures in Canberra, she was the one who could have come through and in the end replaced Dutton and tried and kind of moderated things back towards the centre a bit. She's an engineer. She spoke out against the Morrison government's incredible misogynistic mishandling of various allegations during the last Parliament, but she's bowing out. And, you know, we've said it ourselves in the past, you can be a leader and be very lucky in your opposition leaders. And I think Dan Andrews is such a politician. But boy, Albo has won the opposition leader lottery of his life in Dutton. And that's why I want to read this piece of John Cain's afterward. Shortly before the 1993 federal poll, a young man stopped me in the street and spoke to me about the coming election. "I've voted Labor in every election," he said. "I'm now 33 years old, so I voted Labor in about 10 elections in all over the last 12 or 13 years. A couple of years ago, I lost my house because of 15 to 16% interest rates, and I blame Labor for that. Now, I don't have a job. I blame Labor for that." When he paused, I tried to offer some soothing words explaining what had been happening in the harsh economy here and overseas, but he interrupted me. "Hang on, I'm still going to vote Labor because I think the other mob's worse. When I do get a job, Labor will at least try and protect the job I have and my wages and conditions. The other mob want to take it away and throw me on the scrap heap if I don't produce enough. That young man's attitudes, John Cain continued, were reflected thousands of times over in Australia at the 1993 poll. It's been described as the poll that Labor shouldn't have won and the Conservatives shouldn't have lost, the unlosable election, as far as the Conservative parties were concerned. I suspect that if I had met that young man again in March 1994, a year after he voted in that memorable election, his attitude wouldn't have changed much. He would have voted again by way of default, not by way of commitment. I'm going to say today that I think it's a very dangerous place for the Albanese government to be. It's right to enjoy the glow, enjoy the moment, perhaps expand its perceived scope for action. I think the government's tremendously benefited by Anthony Albanese's temperament. His broad likability is a remarkable political asset, and it's no doubt bumping up, well beyond just the Dutton factor, Labor's standing and his own polling, and it's a great asset. But you don't just want to win by default. And look, there are two reasons for that. One, Labor, the way parties are recalibrating, and my chapter in here is on the state of the parties. The way politics is recalibrating at the minute, Labor has become, in effect, the party of the centre for now. Labor's vote is vulnerable to the Greens on one side. It's especially vulnerable in that sense in Queensland. The Labor Party branch in Australia, I'm delighted to be able to say this in Melbourne, the Labor Party branch in Australia that is the most laggard, dysfunctional and hopeless. And that's why a couple of Greens were elected in metropolitan Brisbane at the last election. So Labor's got that vulnerability on one side. Currently, the coalition are so far to the right, normal Australians, regular Australians can't relate to them. And you will have seen the 6-point drop in the primary vote revealed in the Resolve poll in the Age and Sydney Morning Herald today as evidence of that. It won't necessarily stay like that forever. There's a potential renewal of a kind possible on that side. I would argue it's pretty unlikely. It's a bit like a house that needs to be renovated. You go and size up the house, you get the engineers and the builders in, you quantify it. Some houses you just can't renovate, you've got to bowl them over. And people forget one of the big differences in political history since Federation is that Labor predates as a party Federation and has existed despite the stresses and strains and occasional splits the entire time. But the Liberal Party is in fact the 5th iteration of the main right of centre political party in Australia. It has survived by phoenixing itself like a dodgy subby, right? And it's in such a bad state now that you could not rule out sometime in the future, sooner rather than later, another collapse and some sort of rebirth. Why do I say that? I'm not tipping it for today, I'm not tipping it for tomorrow, I'm not tipping it for next year. But if you talk to people in the Liberal Party who are trying to drag it back from the mad right, they face this very fundamental issue. The conversation goes like this. I played golf last year with someone who's very active in one straight branch, trying to drag them back. I said, well, what are you doing? And they said, oh, we're trying. And I said, well, why isn't it working? Oh, it's hard. I said, why don't you take legal action? That's often in extremes the one thing will stick. It was fascinating, the response. It was, when we do, we get the result. But then when we go to the party organs to try and implement the result, it's unimplementable because all the key organs of the party are so thoroughly captured by the Maddies. So I saw Karen Andrews walk away from federal politics in effect yesterday, and I thought that is a person who doesn't think the House is renovatable. Now, from the other side of the slate, you get some overexcited teals at times who go, wow, maybe we should start a new party. And I go, well, think about that for a minute. One of your virtues, one of your attractions as a candidate has been that you're independent of parties. And you spend a lot of time trashing parties as inherently unattractive, unwieldy, noxious influences, something with which I strongly disagree. But occasionally they have these ideas. Now, I think it would actually be contrary to their self-interest in terms of their individual potential for re-election. However, there's a really interesting new chemistry potentially afoot, and that is the significant minority of Liberal Party branch members and even some MPs who are organising to very actively and prominently participate in the Yes Voice referendum campaign. Now, something's going to happen when those Teals and their supporters, who are nearly all ex-Liberals, campaign on a galvanising issue of national importance, literally on the ground in the same spots. Who knows what's going to happen? Maybe it'll be like a bad party in Morgan East on a Saturday night and it won't go anywhere. But on the other hand, it could go off like a bottle of crew if those two forces get together, and I won't be held responsible for whatever party events happen as a result. And I grew up in South Australia, so I've seen things like the Liberal movement pop up unexpectedly and have a bit of an impact. So just to wrap up, this is a book about what I think any reasonable analyst would conclude, and do conclude, was the worst government since Federation. It's really, really important that we don't fail to stop, read across portfolio areas and review exactly what happened, exactly where we ended up after this 20 out of 26 years of coalition government federally, specifically where we ended up under this government, the worst of the lot. That's obviously a necessary thing to do in and of itself, but I want to pull out just a couple of examples briefly to show why it's important. AUKUS. Now, we may well need nuclear submarines. Maybe we do, maybe we don't. AUKUS is the product of Scott Morrison and one staffer, right? Now, Labor backed AUKUS in opposition. That was necessary. It was the right thing to do. You had to pick your fights carefully going into an election like that. The Albanese government is only in office with a majority of 2 seats. But once in office, without reneging on policy commitments taken towards the election, you can nevertheless and should stop and go back to first principles and go, are we doing the right thing in every key portfolio? And I'm just taking AUKUS as an example. Again, because we're all of a certain age, we all know, we're all familiar with the terms which have long fallen out of use: green paper and white paper. You don't have to call them green paper and white paper to understand their value, but to remind for anyone who's online who's under the age of 50, green paper, the idea is you take a really important policy issue, you get your public service department experts to work up a paper describing the issue, providing the key data, outlining different approaches to it, and putting it out for discussion and consultation. It comes back to the government. The government considers the green paper consultation results and then produces a white paper, which is effectively its draft position on its own likely stance. Then it puts it out for consultation. Brilliant, kick the tires, Hell, you might have a key thought on AUKUS that I haven't thought of, if you're the Defence Minister. You take that and then you finalise the government position. It's a great process. John Cain and his government were brilliant at it. Without calling it green papers and white papers, the Hawke government and Keating government were very, very good at it. As a result, the community and journalists were included in the conversation. They came to understand the issues more deeply. Expectations could be structured prior to government positions being announced, which then were much more likely to get uptake from voters. An excellent, excellent process. But let's compare and contrast with AUKUS. Now, what I as a voter would like to see is an answer to the question, do we need new submarines? I think it's pretty obvious the answer is yes, we need new submarines, largely because the coalition left us with an embarrassing dearth of actual ability to defend ourselves because of their chaotic defence material purchasing program, completely unlinked to any real defence strategy. So yes, we need subs. But do we need nuclear subs? Well, let's be open to the answer. Let's see the case. What's the case for and against nuclear subs? And let's consider it. If, and I say if, the answer is yes, and then let's ask the question, which nuclear subs and from whom? Now, I get up every morning and thank God, secular God, that this man is no longer Prime Minister. And then the next thought is, where's the coffee? And then the thought after that is, gosh, the Albanese government's doing so well on so many key policy areas. I won't go through now, they're obvious to you, obvious to me, where the government is doing so well. But then I think of a few really important areas where they could do a lot better. And I think AUKUS is a big example. I had a visceral reaction as an Australian seeing our Prime Minister on the stage with a jumped up, very ordinary Tory Prime Minister from Britain and a gigantic Union Jack. Now, you wouldn't buy a British car. Why would you buy a British nuclear submarine? It's never too late. It's never too late to rediscover your passion for the good, time-tested, true forms of sound policy development. And you call them what you like, and call them pink paper and a purple paper. I don't care. But AUKUS is a classic. Do we need subs? If so, do we need nuclear subs? If we need nuclear subs, if so, from whom and why? It's not too late. And that's not an attack on Richard Marles. I love Richard Marles madly, but it's an area we need to do better. The other example I'd say is, and this really points, coming back to we're looping back to the APS issue here, is public health policy. Now, I think of Neil Blewett rolling in his grave, looking at the absolutely pathetic, half-assed, limp, hopeless government stance and policy performance on public health right now in relation to COVID. COVID has for some time now, for several months now, been the third leading cause of death in Australia. There's a very strong report in The Age today talking about the massive under-vaccination in nursing homes. And, I was going to say, don't start me on COVID. We'll be here till Tuesday week talking about how policy will be improved in this area. It's a clear do better stance. The fact is, Mark Butler has now had more dead people on his watch than any health minister as a result of an infectious disease, I think, in the post-war period, and that's not something to glory in and something that's easily fixed. And here we come to the last puzzle before I hand over some comments and questions from you, is there is a unique problem right now. Like, we have never faced this as a nation before, this problem, in that like me in Canberra, strong supporters of the Westminster system. God knows, and reading John Cain's accounts of John Stone here during some of those Commonwealth state relations struggles, red hot. So I'm not saying that public servants are always right, saintly, good, or whatever. But in terms of systems design, if you want to get frank and fearless advice, you've got to restore the system. You've got to do the choice architecture so that people can afford to give frank and fearless advice again. Now, I hate to say it, but it is true and must be faced up to. that before John Howard, the Hawke government was the one that broke the chain that ended permanency for departmental secretaries. John Howard drove a truck through it, but Labor did it. It also brought in performance pay, another disaster in the APS. Now, everyone in Canberra has been a gob at the Royal Commission, but I can tell you right now, inside the system, people are assuming and saying that it was a problem restricted to the Department of Human Services. A very convenient argument to avoid facing up to the fundamental restoration of the choice architecture of the APS that prevents things happening like Renée Leon hitting the stop button on Robo-Debt when her minister wouldn't, and then getting sacked 4 weeks later. There is a dangerous view by even people who really want to improve the APS and restore its integrity that a restoration of permanency for secretaries, an end to performance pay, that they're not necessary, when in fact they are absolutely essential, because any system that relies on people just doing the right thing and having the courage of their convictions is a very weak system. So I think that's requires some thought from the government. Of course, I run around in Canberra grabbing anyone I can by the lapels and going, fix the APS choice architecture. And I'm not going to stop, because without a strong, confident APS, John Cain would have told us, we're stuffed. He outlines when Labor fell here, the drastic attack on the public sector that happened and the impact that it had. It doesn't have to be that way. And it doesn't mean you have to keep those secretaries. You can send them on gardening leave. There are a lot of overseas posts. There's Lagos, there's Wellington, and if that's the price to pay, if sending Catherine Campbell to Wellington is the price to pay, other secretaries being able to be frank and fearless in their advice, I, as a taxpayer, am totally prepared to pay that price. And now I would like you to bring it at me. Comments, questions?
Thank you for all that. What about the stage 3 tax cuts?
I'm glad you asked that. Probably no one else would answer that way, right?
It's a no-brainer.
I'm really glad you asked that. I've had 2 books out in 3 months. I've got this edited collection now, but the book that came out in February, which I foolishly didn't bring to the podium so I could wave it around and say, buy this book too. That's a scholarly work on political biographies, political intervention since Federation. And publication was delayed because I woke up the day after the 2019 election and thought, I cannot stand it anymore. I cannot stand Labor throwing away election wins when voters, and I'm not just talking about Labor voters, I'm talking also about the very large number of voters in the middle who will just toss out bad governance and want, by default, someone else to come in and try and do better. Just couldn't stand it anymore. So I delayed finishing Political Lives, which has just come out, in order to write a book called How to Win an Election. And your question goes absolutely to one of the core parts of that. Now, in How to Win an Election, I say, and I'm using Shorten's 2019 loss as the prism for this book. We've drawn a bit on the 2016 election in the context of elections over the last 50 years and what conclusions we can draw. One of them is, if you want to win an election from opposition, which is incredibly hard and very rarely done, be a smart target. Now, everybody's stuck in this small target, large target binary. It is palaver. Be a smart target. Do what Albanese did in 2022. Give people as few reasons as possible not to vote for you, and give key voting groups reasons to vote for you and win. Then in government, you can be as bold as you like. You've got the extra resources of government. You've got the ability to execute much better. For that reason, you can do what you like. But Albanese to get elected, in order to not accept the coalition's invitation to a fight that would have possibly caused Labor to lose by 2 seats instead of win by 2 seats, let those tax cuts go through. What is the impact of walking away from such a clear commitment? It's bad. It allows even your weak opposition as it is now, it gives them a cudgel to beat you with every day between the time you back off from the commitment to the next election. And if you've only won by 2 seats, you know, there's no such thing as a certain election. Labor is not a shoe-in next time. Just think about, for example, Theresa May calling that election, and you saw where she ended up.
Can I back that up with the second question?
Yeah, I'll just finish first. To me, keeping flagship promises, especially in the first term, is crucial. Don't give the other side a weapon. But this is the clincher. Especially when there is so much scope in the budget to get the net benefits of cancelling the stage 3 tax cuts without having to actually do it in this term of government. Tax expenditures, you know, if I was the angel on Jim Chalmers' shoulder, I'd be saying, cancel tax expenditures on the resource sector now, right? Okay, we've lost the votes of the board of Woodside, who cares, right? And we've got a lot more money in the kitty. The second,
in a couple of weeks.
bring it on. And, you know, there's lots of other tax expenditures you do too. So in other words, there's a lot of scope for us clawing back revenue in effect without having to do that. Applying the actual rules that Josh Frydenberg didn't on the obscene grants to corporations during COVID would be another. So I would say keep the state, don't back off now on stage 3 tax cuts. The next election, a strong Prime Minister in a good position could argue for the cancellation positively and get a mandate to do it. But don't just gratuitously do it would be my response. What's your second?
That was my backup question. Will he take it to the next election?
I would be very surprised if he didn't, and that's the right thing to do. And of course, remember Howard's second election, he was in a really weak position. He came up with a GST. The full machinery of government was put behind it, and he won. So yeah, I hope he does it.
Can I jump in on just quickly on that? As I always do, sorry. They won't cancel them. I reckon they'll take a redesign of stage 3 to target them more fairly, and they'll take that to the next election. That's my hope.
And knowing Emma, it's probably not just off the top of her head, but probably a connected and informed comment. Stick with Emma.
I hope you know going back to John Kane. The day of John Kane's election into the seat of Bandura, there was no branch of Bandura. We didn't have it. It was Greensboro, and David knows this story. I'm sure he remembers. There was Bandura, there was Greensboro on one end, and because I lived in Bandura and I had to be a member of Greensboro. Or Thomastown at the other, west. And a member of Thomastown came to see me at home. I lived in Rio. And he said, we need a branch urgent. We don't have a branch. He's running for parliament. We haven't got a branch. So we put together, we grabbed a few pieces of paper, we called a couple of meetings at home, and we had a branch. If anybody complained, we just told them to shut up and go home. And so we have a branch. And the day of the actual election, at 6:05, came a flying station wagon covered in dust. It was very dusty. To a little old primary school, which was over 100 years old in Manila. The only one around for a long time. And he stopped the car, or somebody who drive and stopped the car and said, all right, go home, clean up, we're having a party at home. And that was the job. And many of us met him as a family property lawyer. He was obviously in high school. And used him as such. He was a good man, he was very loyal. And right down to the conversations about within weeks of his death, he remembered us all. He was a great person. Never mind a politician, a great person. And just the mention of his efforts, it's very, very good. We then did end up with a branch. By then I had moved and I was in Elva. So,
For those online, you've just missed a fantastic and very
thank you.
beautiful and moving account of
Okay.
John Kane's very early branch history and relationship with branch members, which just confirms why we all need those bands made. What would WWJCD?
People turned up for the first function, and we had to move from the upstairs office down to the pub because there wasn't enough room. And we got Raylan and Margaret were there. It was such an occasion that I don't think anyone who was there would forget.
Thank you.
Yeah. I can't understand why the Liberals haven't booted Morrison and Roberts out, nor why they sat pat on Porter and Tudge, waiting for them to move on. And whenever there have been issues, they've linked arms to protect the person having to defend themselves. The image portrayed is a terrible look. It's of a party of particularly undesirable wrongdoms, many of whom haven't been yet outed. There's more to come. And there is no evidence that replacements are likely to be any different. They're likely to be in the political wilderness a long time. I'm not displeased about that, but what's your thoughts?
Well, just for those at home, a very powerful comment / question about the very, very poor quality and amorality of senior figures in the coalition these days, and the unlikelihood of their re-election anytime imminently. Again, I think one of the issues is they don't realise how bad they are.
That's right.
I think I think it's kind of very ironic that under this allegedly God-fearing man, they've lost their moral bearings, they've lost their true north. And the whole setup is, the whole coalition setup now is very crony capitalist. Walk into a branch meeting and feel the Bible and smell the coals, it's like that. And I don't know if you've read Julia Banks's book, Power Play, but terrific book. I mean, her whole experience with the coalition, being bullied horribly by the Prime Minister, leaving the party. I mean, if no woman walks into the ballot box now without remembering those stories, the Morrison's handling of Brittany Higgins, Christian Porter, I mean, it's a horror show. But when is that house can it be renovated or must it be dozed? I mean, I think Karen Andrews has just gone, well, it's probably got to be dozed, and I'm too old to stick around and participate in that. And I've got to say, I think this is a terrible tragedy for the nation. Probably 110% of people in this room have voted Labor all their lives, right? But we too need a good coalition or successor to the coalition, because there's no such thing as a healthy one-party state. And God knows there are Labor Party governments in the past that needed a boot up the arse. And unless there's, as the economists would say, unless you've got a contestable market, unless there's an electable opposition, you don't get that effect. So let's hope they get their act together. In my dreams, and I'm very anti-drug, but if I dropped acid and was having a good trip, the whole show would re-emerge with, say, Mon Ryan as the new leader of a centre-right party, because I think she's a tremendously talented politician, very brainy, excellent on policy, guts. We'll watch this space. Let's have dinner. Let's have lunch again in 10 years and we'll see if there's a new coalition.
I should explain. The reason for my question was I was in the gallery when Morrison was being, I guess, sent to Privileges Committee, and he gave a 20-minute interview that didn't deny he'd done anything wrong. All his front benchers walked, other than probably a couple of them, shook his hand and basically wouldn't wouldn't do anything about
birds of a feather. And they just want to double down and really lock in that misogynist white guy vote, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just wanted, so I wondered if you would talk a bit more about, you saying with what needs to happen to rebuild the APS. What are your thoughts about how we're outsourcing advice to outside consultants and what the next steps are under this government to sort of reset that role back in the APS?
Yes, that's an extremely relevant question. And heads up, the cool person to be reading at the minute is Mariana Mazzucato, the economist from, I think it's UCL in London. Yeah. She's her book published a couple of weeks ago, The Big Con, compulsory reading. And this is not a kind of side-served taste. Jim Chalmers, the Albanese government treasurer, is a big Mariana Mazzucato fan. He name-checked her amongst several other coming economists in his essay in the Monthly, which if you haven't read, I highly recommend. Look, not all consultants are bad. The outsourcing of government advice entirely to consultants is horrific. And as Mazzucato outlines in The Big Con, it leads to really, really bad policy advice, ignorant, short-term, and designed to please the commissioning minister. Very, very bad. That said, good consultants, great. Like, would I hire per capita any day? They are not McKinsey, they are not BCG. Anyone who followed the Robodebt Royal Commission would have some graphic examples of just how bad some of the consultants' work in that was, just how craven it was. Relatively early on in the Howard government, a saying developed in the Attorney General's Department in relation to policy advice to the Howard government. Oh, tell them what it was short for was tell them whatever they want to hear. So, yeah, I mean, I would like to say that every Albanese government minister is alert to this issue, but I'm here to tell you I know of examples where they have no insert expletive idea and I know at least one in which consultants are going in and out of their office all the time. It hasn't become visible yet, but yeah, it's an issue. The Big Con, read it.
Just to follow on from that question, how do you guarantee the independence of the public service without locking in this generation of partisan appointments?
I'm glad you raised that. So the comment/question is, how do you deal with the current situation? And I think I started talking about this but didn't follow through and make that point, which is what I in fact wanted to say. There's this unique problem at the minute in that the APS has been systematically run down and cowed under 20 out of 26 years of federal government under the coalition, and also under the Rudd government. Rudd was very, very bad, treated his public servants very badly. A lot of good public servants hung in for the change of government, and then having experienced some early Rudd government manoeuvres left. So it's not 100% coalition problem, but significantly so, massively so. But yes, what do you do? Do you restore Westminster principles entirely, really stick with the permanency thing? Does that mean you've got Liberal appointees stacked through the system for the next 20 years working their way out? Well, I just come back to the Lagos principle. Is that posting in Lagos? Is that posting in Wellington? There are other desirable posts that key people can be moved out to, but not fired. You'll notice Catherine Campbell, the anti-star of the Robodebt Royal Commission, has not been fired. She's been parked at a desk, in effect, in the broader defence portfolio. I myself am deeply concerned that people like Paul Kelly, the Chief Medical Officer, that Scott Morrison handpicked in order to get the result he got and we're now getting. Like, I'm going, why am I waking up in a world where we're getting that poor quality advice still? And there's got to be a government post at our mission in Geneva. Paul Kelly. Brendan Murphy, the Departmental Secretary of Health, is again a Morrison Government appointee of, shall we say, fairly pedestrian quality.
Yeah.
Keeping it nice. He's retiring, so that's another option. But yes, it is a serious problem. How do you deal with this moment when the system's jammed up with people who don't understand what Westminster is, couldn't care less, and we've got to live with them? I'm actually giving a lecture on June the 6th to address just that question, so stay tuned.
One more.
Sorry.
No, go.
I'm just taken with when you talked about how the rot set in even before Howard. It's now just
No, not before Howard. The rot didn't set in, but the changes that appeared minor, then bad actors drove trucks through and misused.
now that also corresponds with the period in the United States that this wonderful new book by Naomi Oreskes is talking about the big myth and about this genuine conspiracy to devalue evidence, science, knowledge, and to push the idea that freedom and democracy depended on a free market.
Yes,
And
disastrous.
so this is a massive global effort that because I mean, what I see in Howard's era is the introduction of meanness. The mean little nasty man who was taking revenge on all the people who teased him as a boy at school.
I do wish you'd form an opinion,
Bad
Jan.
cricket.
I do wish you'd form an opinion.
Yes, but I think we that helps to see, and in that global perspective, it's all we all say neoliberalism, but
I carefully didn't say that word once today. That showed great mistake.
that's very good. But the way in which this is documented and what was done to
I agree.
shift the narrative globally is really quite extraordinary.
That's right. And Noam Chomsky, of course, identified the mechanism. You deprive a public sector entity of resources, it then starts to fail. Then the government points at it and says, see, it's a failure, we've got to privatise it. And, you know, as I said in the lounge at Melbourne Airport this morning, looking out at the lobster tail planes, I thought Qantas is like a metaphor for the disaster, you know, even though it's just an airline. You know, back in the day, you could fly on that airline knowing you were being taken care of by staff who were employed by that airline, who had proper health and safety, who had a fleet that was being properly invested in. You're right, it's long-term trends, it's disturbing. You even meet Labor kind of oriented public servants in Canberra who no longer believe that the public sector is capable of doing anything effectively. And that's how thoroughly brainwashed everyone is.
Yeah.
And I know we've got to finish soon, but I'm teaching at the moment at the University of Canberra, and I had a class give presentations yesterday. And the task was you had to team up and identify a policy challenge, you had to analyse it and come up with a more effective way of addressing it. One student in one group only raised expanding the scope of action by the public sector to solve a problem. No one else even thought of it. Can I just very quickly sneak in a mini question here?
Oh, thank you. You asked the question, what do you do about public service? One of the answers I found as a public servant was be in the fortunate position of working to a minister who you may or may not have voted for, who knew what they wanted, who knew what the public service could do, and expected that you would provide them with the options that would allow them to move on. This was a drug that moved even the laggards when there was a change of government, as in the Kane government, where the VPS beforehand was, let's say, very ordinary. There were people in the VPS, as there were people in the Queensland Public Service when Wayne Goss got in, who realised the minister's questions were serious, they merited a serious answer, and if you answered one hard question well, you got lots more. There was nothing more energising for public servants than that.
Look, you're so right. One issue is you're a current minister. Even if you want to turn to the current APS and get answers and deal with them professionally, you have doubts. So what do? too many ministers at the moment still in the Albanese government are calling them consultants. Somewhere, sometime, we've got to start renovating the house, and that time, in this case, needs to be now. Thank you.
We could have kept going today, Chris. Thank you so much. Do, if you can, pick up a copy of the book. It is really, really worthwhile. I haven't read every single chapter yet, but there are some absolute crackers in there. And thank you again for inviting me to be part of it. We don't have a speaker lined up for May yet. I'm doing my best. It's the week after the federal budget. I'm hoping it will be an opportunity for us to reflect on what's in that budget and have a really good discussion about that. So we will look out for our newsletter. We'll let you know who that's going to be on the 16th of May next month. And then in June, we're being joined by Mark Considine, who will speak to us about his book, The Careless State, which really looks at a lot of these issues of outsourcing core government services, particularly in social services, and how that has failed our country. So that will be an interesting discussion as well. But thank you all for coming. On a fairly cold day, it's very hard to get into this building at the moment. So you've all made a real effort to get to Graduate House. Thank you. I'm parked miles away, but I'll manage it. And I look forward to seeing you all next month. Thank you again to Chris Wallace and to our audience on Zoom.